Chosen one, I need you to stop scrolling for just a moment, because something in you already knew you'd find this today. Listen carefully. You did not click on this by accident. There is a reason you are hearing this right now, in this exact season of your life, when everything feels heavier than it should, and quieter than you expected. Something led you here, and whatever that something is, it doesn't usually get things wrong. You may have noticed it. The way certain rooms feel too loud for you now. The way you've started pulling back from people who used to feel safe. The way your own thoughts have gotten louder at night, asking questions nobody around you seems to be asking. That is not weakness. That is not you falling apart. That is something in you waking up. And once something wakes up inside a person, it rarely goes back to sleep the same way it used to. Nothing about your life has been accidental. Not the loneliness. Not the long stretches where nothing made sense. Not the friendships that quietly faded, or the doors that closed right when you thought they'd open. Every one of those moments was shaping something in you that comfort never could have built. You don't see it yet, not fully, but you will. Pieces that felt scattered for years have a strange way of lining up the moment you stop, demanding they make sense right now. You were never ordinary. I know it doesn't always feel that way. I know there have been nights you've looked at people who seem to move through life so easily, laughing without weight, sleeping without thinking, and you've wondered what's wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You were just built to carry more, see more, feel more than the life around you was ready for. That isn't a curse. It's a kind of design most people never get assigned, because most people were never meant to carry it. Type yes if this is starting to feel a little too familiar. Think about the people who plant trees they will never sit under the shade of. They dig into hard ground, plant something small, and walk away without ever seeing what it becomes. That's what some of your hardest seasons have been doing inside you. You couldn't see the tree yet. You only felt the digging. But something was being planted in you during those years that you didn't choose and didn't enjoy. And it's still growing whether you can see it or not. Even in your hardest moments. When you didn't say a word about what you were going through. Something was still happening underneath the surface. Pain has a strange way of becoming a teacher when nothing else will reach you. The version of you that exists right now, tired but still standing, is not the same person who went through all of that for nothing. You came out different, stronger in a quiet way that doesn't need applause, and doesn't need anyone to notice it to be real. There is a kind of sensitivity some people carry that the world doesn't always know what to do with. You feel things before they happen. You sense tension in a room before anyone speaks. You absorb other people's pain like it's your job to hold it. If that sounds like you, it's not a flaw. It's a kind of awareness most people never develop, because most people never had to. You were shaped by enough difficulty to become fluent in a language other people haven't even learned to recognize yet. This is your confirmation that the isolation you've felt was never punishment. Some seasons of distance exist so you can hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. Some friendships fall away not because you did something wrong, but because you were quietly outgrowing rooms that were never meant to hold the next version of you. A room built for who you used to be will always feel a little too small once you've grown past it. Comment a mammon. if you've ever felt like you were being pulled away from people for reasons you couldn't explain at the time. There's an old idea about seasons that most people forget the moment life gets hard. Winter looks like nothing is happening. The ground looks dead. The trees look empty. But underneath the surface, roots are doing the most important work they'll ever do, quietly, in the dark, without applause. If your life has felt like a winter lately, that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the part of you that matters most is being strengthened where no one can see it yet. You were never meant to live small just to make other people comfortable. There's a difference between humility and shrinking yourself, and somewhere along the way, life taught you to do the second one to survive. That season is allowed to end. You're allowed to take up space again. You're allowed to want something more than just getting through the day, even if wanting more feels unfamiliar after so long spent just trying to hold on. Think about how many times you've kept going when you had every reason to stop. Think about the mornings you didn't think you'd make it through, and somehow you did. That's not luck. People don't survive that many hard seasons by accident. There's something steady underneath you that's been holding you up even when you couldn't feel it. Even on the days you were sure you were holding yourself up alone. God has been preparing you quietly in the background of your life in ways you probably didn't notice at the time. Not through comfort, but through contrast. Through showing you what isn't for you so clearly that you'd recognize what is for you when it finally arrives. The closed doors weren't cruelty. They were redirection, and redirection only feels like rejection until you can see the road it was actually pointing you toward. Type 90 if you trust that your timing has not been wasted, even when it felt like it was. I want you to think about something for a second. How many times has something fallen apart right before it would have hurt you worse later? How many times did a plan collapse, and months later you understood exactly why it had to? That's not coincidence stacking up over and over again in your life. That's protection wearing a disguise that only makes sense once you're far enough away to look back at it clearly. Think of a river that hits a rock in its path. It doesn't stop, it bends. It finds another way around, and somehow it still reaches the same ocean it was always heading toward, just along a different route than it expected. Your life has bent more times than you probably wanted it to. But bending isn't the same as breaking, and a river that bends still arrives exactly where it was always going. There's a version of strength that doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't post highlight reels. It doesn't get celebrated. It looks like waking up anyway. It looks like showing up to work after a sleepless night because of something no one else knows you're carrying. It looks like still being kind to people even when you're running on empty inside. That kind of strength is rare, and if you recognize it in yourself, it's because you've earned it the hard way, one ordinary day at a time. You may have spent a long time feeling misunderstood. Like people only see the surface version of you, the one that's easier to deal with, while the deeper parts of who you are stay quiet because explaining them feels exhausting. That gap between how you're seen and who you actually are can feel like its own kind of loneliness. But that depth in you isn't something to apologize for. It's something the people around you simply haven't caught up to yet, and some of them never will, and that's allowed to be okay too. Like this video, if any part of this has felt like it was written just for you. Here's something worth sitting with. The hardest seasons of your life were also the seasons that built the parts of you that can't be shaken now. Comfort never built resilience in anyone. Difficulty did. Every time you got back up after something tried to take you out, you were quietly becoming someone the next version of your life is going to need. The version of you that exists 5 years from now is being built right now, in this exact season, whether it feels like progress or not. There's a strange kind of grace in the way certain people get tested more than others. It isn't fair, and it never feels good while it's happening. But the people who go through the most difficult seasons often come out carrying something the people around them simply don't have. Not because suffering is special on its own, but because of what it forces a person to confront, to release, and eventually to rebuild from the ground up. You don't have to perform certainty to keep moving forward. It's okay to still have questions. It's okay to not have the whole picture yet. Faith was never about having every answer. It was always about choosing to keep walking even when the road ahead is unclear, trusting that the next step will make sense once you take it. Some of the most faithful people who ever lived spent most of their lives walking without seeing very far ahead of them. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together for other people while quietly falling apart on the inside. If you know that feeling, you know how heavy it gets to be the strong one in every room, the one everyone leans on, while no one thinks to ask how you're actually doing. That exhaustion is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged, not just pushed through silently again and again, year after year, until it becomes the only way you know how to exist. Type 120 if you've been the strong one for everyone else, and it's time someone said that out loud for you. Think about a lighthouse for a moment. It doesn't go looking for the ships that need it. It just stands there, steady, lit in the middle of every storm, and the ships find their own way toward it. You've probably been that for more people than you realize. People who needed steadiness found it in you without ever telling you how much it mattered. That's not a small thing. Standing still and steady while everything around you moves is its own quiet form of strength, even when nobody thanks the lighthouse for staying lit. Here's the part that matters most. Feeling tired doesn't mean you're losing. It means you've been carrying weight long enough to know what real endurance costs. The people who give up early never feel this kind of exhaustion because they stopped trying before it got hard. You're still here, still trying, still showing up. That alone says something about who you are underneath all the noise. Something that doesn't need anyone's permission to be true. Think about timing for a moment. Not the timing you wanted, but the timing that actually happened. The job that didn't come through, only for a better one to open up later. The relationship that ended right before something healthier could begin. The plan that fell apart just before a different door opened that you didn't even know existed yet. Looking back, you can usually see it. The thing that felt like loss was actually clearing space for something you couldn't have made room for any other way. You are allowed to believe that your life is still moving towards something, even on the days it doesn't feel like it. Especially on those days. Belief was never meant to depend on visible proof. It was meant to hold steady in the moments when there's nothing to point to yet, except a quiet certainty that you haven't come this far for no reason. That certainty doesn't shout. It just stays patiently underneath everything else. There is a kind of transformation that happens slowly, almost without you noticing, until one day you look back and realize you don't react to things the way you used to. You don't panic over the same things. You don't chase the same approval. You've changed in ways that took years to settle into you. And that change is part of the reason you're hearing all of this right now, because you're finally in a place to actually receive it the way it was meant to land. Think about how differently you respond to things now compared to who you were a few years ago. The version of you from back then would have reacted to half of what you've walked through this year. But you didn't. You stayed steady. You handled it. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not without struggle, but you handled it in a way the old version of you simply couldn't have. That's not nothing. That's evidence that something inside you has actually shifted, even on the days you feel like nothing has changed at all. There's a quiet kind of loneliness that comes from being the one who notices everything. You notice the shift in someone's tone before they say what's wrong. You notice the tension in a room before anyone names it. You feel the weight other people carry, even when they insist they're fine. That kind of awareness is exhausting, but it's also rare, and the world needs people who can sense what others miss, even if it costs you something to keep sensing it. Comment Amen if you've ever felt the weight of noticing things other people walk right past. You may have spent years wondering why certain things had to happen to you specifically, why the loss landed on you, why the betrayal found its way to your door, why the hardest seasons seemed to circle back around more than once. There may not be a clean answer to all of that, not yet. Maybe not ever fully. But there is a difference between something happening to you for no reason and something happening to you that is still being used for something, even slowly, even quietly, even when it doesn't feel like it yet. Think about how much you've already survived that you don't talk about. The nights you don't mention. The mornings you forced yourself out of bed when everything in you wanted to stay under the covers. The conversations you held together while falling apart on the inside. Nobody gives out medals for that kind of survival, but it counts. It has always counted, even when no one was watching closely enough to see it. There's a reason certain people go through more isolation than others before their lives start to make sense. Isolation strips away the noise. It removes the constant input of other people's opinions, expectations, and approval, until all that's left is your own voice, finally loud enough to hear clearly. Some people never get quiet enough, long enough to hear themselves think. You did. That's not a punishment. That's a strange kind of gift disguised as a hard season. Type yes if you've started to hear your own voice more clearly during a season of distance from other people. Think about how a seed has to be buried completely in the dark before it can grow into anything at all. It doesn't get to skip that part. It doesn't get to stay in the light and still become a tree. The burial isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of one, even though from where the seed sits, surrounded by dirt and darkness, it probably feels like the opposite is true. If your life has felt buried lately, that doesn't mean it's over. It might mean something is about to break through the surface. You don't owe anyone an explanation for the season you're in right now. Not the people who don't understand why you've pulled back. Not the people who think you should be further along by now. Not the people who measure your worth by how much you're producing. achieving, or performing. Some seasons are simply meant to be lived through quietly, without an audience, without applause, and that's allowed to be enough. There's a difference between giving up and slowing down, and most people confuse the two. Slowing down is wisdom. It's listening to your body and your spirit when they're telling you that something needs to change. Giving up is walking away from the path entirely. You haven't given up. You're still here, still reading this, still searching for something that makes sense of all of it. That alone tells you which one you're actually doing. Like this video if you've been mistaking your slow season for failure, when really it might just be preparation in disguise. Think about how many storms you've already walked through that you genuinely thought would be the end of you. The ones where you couldn't see a way out. The ones where every option felt impossible. And yet here you are, still breathing, still moving forward, having made it through every single one of them so far. That's not a small thing to carry. That's proof, real proof, that whatever comes next, you have already shown yourself capable of surviving things that once felt unsurvivable. There's a kind of peace that doesn't depend on your circumstances changing. It's not the absence of struggle. It's a steadiness that exists even in the middle of struggle, a quiet sense that things are still unfolding the way they're supposed to, even when the unfolding is slow, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you can't see the next 10 steps clearly. That kind of peace isn't something you manufacture. It's something that grows in you over time, through every hard season you didn't choose but walked through anyway. You may feel like you're behind where you thought you'd be, behind the people around you, behind some invisible timeline you never agreed to but somehow absorbed anyway. But timing was never meant to be a competition. Some things bloom early and fade fast. Other things take longer to grow because they were built to last. If your life has taken longer than you expected, that might be less about delay and more about depth. Type 120 if you're ready to release the timeline you've been comparing yourself to and trust your own instead. There's something powerful about a person who has been hurt and chose not to become hard. Plenty of people go through pain and let it close them off, make them bitter, make them suspicious of everyone and everything. But some people go through the exact same kind of pain and somehow come out the other side more compassionate, not less. If that's been your path, if you've stayed soft in places that could have easily hardened you, that softness is not weakness. It's one of the rarest forms of strength there is. Think about every person who has ever come to you when they were struggling, even when you yourself were barely holding on. Think about how many times you set your own pain aside to make room for someone else's. That kind of capacity doesn't happen by accident. It's built slowly through your own suffering until you became someone who understands pain well enough to actually sit with other people inside theirs, instead of just offering empty advice from the outside. There's a reason you've never fully fit into certain rooms, certain friend groups, certain versions of normal that other people seemed to slide into so easily. It's not because something is wrong with you. It's because you were never meant to be shaped entirely by your environment. Some people are built to absorb the culture around them completely. Others are built to stay just different enough to eventually become exactly who they were always meant to be, even if that difference made things harder along the way. Comment Amen if you've spent most of your life feeling like you never quite fit the mold. Everyone else seemed to fit so easily. Think about how much courage it actually takes to keep believing in something better when your current circumstances haven't changed yet. It's easy to have hope when things are going well. It's a completely different kind of strength to hold on to hope when nothing around you has shifted, when the waiting has stretched far longer than you expected, when every reasonable signal says to give up, and you choose again and again to keep believing anyway. There's a quiet kind of bravery in continuing to show up for your own life, even when no one is clapping for you. Nobody throws a celebration when you choose to keep going on an ordinary Tuesday that feels heavier than it should. Nobody gives you credit for getting through another hard week quietly, without complaint, without falling apart in front of anyone. But that kind of unnoticed bravery is some of the most real strength a person can have, precisely because it asks for nothing in return. You are allowed to grieve the things you thought your life would look like by now, the relationships you thought would have worked out, the opportunities you thought would have arrived already, the version of yourself you thought you'd be at this point. Grieving those things doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're honest enough to acknowledge that life didn't go the way you planned, while still choosing to keep walking forward into whatever it's actually becoming instead. Type 90 if you're ready to release the version of your life you expected and trust the one that's actually unfolding. Here's something that might be hard to hear, but it's worth saying anyway. Some of the people who hurt you the most along the way were never meant to stay in your story for very long. Their role was smaller than it felt at the time. The pain they caused was real, but it wasn't the whole story, and it doesn't get to write the ending either. You get to decide what the rest of your story looks like, regardless of how painful certain chapters were to live through. Think about how strange it is that the things that broke you down the most have also been the things that taught you the most about who you actually are underneath all the layers other people built around you. Comfort rarely teaches anyone anything they didn't already believe about themselves. It's the breaking that reveals what's actually there. If you've been broken down more than once, that also means you've discovered more about your own depth than most people ever get the chance to. There's a particular kind of clarity that only shows up after you've lost something you thought you couldn't live without. The job, the relationship, the plan you built your whole identity around. Losing it feels like the end of everything in the moment. But on the other side of that loss, there's often a clearer picture of who you actually are without it. A version of you that was always there, just buried under everything you thought you needed to be whole. Like this video, if you've found unexpected clarity on the other side of a loss you didn't think you'd survive. You don't need everyone to understand your path for it to be the right one. In fact, some of the most important seasons of growth happen precisely when the people around you don't understand what you're doing or why. If everyone around you fully understood your direction, it might mean you're not actually growing into anything new. Sometimes being misunderstood is simply the cost of becoming someone you haven't been before. There's a difference between people who pour into your life and people who simply take up space in it. Over time, most people learn to tell the difference, often the hard way. If you've recently started noticing who actually shows up for you versus who just expects you to keep showing up for them, that awareness is not bitterness. It's growth. It's you finally seeing relationships clearly, instead of through the lens of who you wish people were. Think about how much energy you've spent trying to make people understand you who were never actually trying to understand you back. That kind of one-sided effort drains something in a person over time. You're allowed to stop. You're allowed to save that energy for the people who actually reciprocate it, the ones who don't need convincing to see your worth, because they already see it clearly, without you having to perform for them. Type yes if you've started protecting your energy differently than you used to, even if it felt uncomfortable at first. There's a kind of quiet confidence that comes from finally trusting your own judgment after years of doubting it. Maybe you spent a long time asking everyone else what they thought before you trusted your own instincts. Maybe you second-guessed yourself into decisions that weren't actually right for you. But something shifts in a person once they finally start trusting what they already knew deep down, even when it goes against what everyone else expected of them. Think about every instinct you've ever ignored because you didn't want to seem difficult, dramatic, or ungrateful. Every time you talked yourself out of a feeling that turned out to be exactly right. There's wisdom in you that you've spent years overriding to keep the peace. That wisdom hasn't disappeared just because you ignored it. It's still there, waiting for you to finally start listening to it, instead of constantly talking yourself out of what you already know. There's something deeply healing about finally giving yourself permission to outgrow people, places, and versions of yourself that no longer fit who you've become. Outgrowing something isn't betrayal. It isn't ingratitude. It's simply what happens when a person continues to grow instead of staying frozen in the same shape, just to make everyone around them comfortable with who they used to be. Comment Amen if you've recently outgrown something or someone, and it's been harder than you expected, even though you know it was right. Think about how much your perspective has shifted just over the past year alone. Things that used to feel like the end of the world now feel like minor setbacks. People whose opinions used to control your entire mood now barely register. That shift didn't happen because life got easier. It happened because you got stronger, quietly, gradually, in ways that probably surprised even you when you finally noticed them. You are not required to explain your healing to people who never witnessed your breaking. Some people only show up at the end of a hard season and expect to understand the whole story just because they're present now. They don't get automatic access to everything you went through to get here. You're allowed to protect that story, to share it only with people who've actually earned the context behind who you've become. There's a strength in choosing to keep your heart open even after it's been hurt badly enough to justify closing it completely. Plenty of people would understand if you became guarded, distant, slow to trust again. But choosing softness anyway, choosing to keep believing the best about people even after some of them disappointed you, that choice is one of the bravest things a person can keep making, over and over, especially when it would be easier not to. Type 120 if you've chosen to stay open and soft even after life gave you every reason to close yourself off. Think about the people throughout history who changed everything around them while looking, on the outside, completely ordinary. Most of the people who shaped the world weren't surrounded by constant recognition while they were doing the work that mattered. They were often overlooked, underestimated, doubted by the very people who should have believed in them first. If you feel overlooked right now, that doesn't disqualify you from anything. It might actually be putting you in good company. There's a quiet kind of faith that doesn't need a dramatic moment to prove itself. It shows up in the ordinary decision to keep being kind when it would be easier to be bitter. It shows up in choosing patience on a day when everything in you wants to give up. It shows up in small, unnoticed moments that nobody will ever write a story about, but that quietly shape the kind of person you're becoming, one decision at a time, far more than any single dramatic moment ever could. You may not feel ready for whatever is coming next in your life. That feeling of not being ready is normal, and it doesn't mean the timing is wrong. Most people who go on to do meaningful things never felt fully ready before they started. Readiness is something that often arrives in the middle of the doing, not before it. You don't have to feel completely prepared to take the next step. You just have to be willing to take it anyway. Like this video, if you're starting to believe that the next season of your life might actually be closer than it feels right now. Think about every version of yourself you've had to let go of along the way. The version that needed everyone's approval. The version that stayed in places long after they stopped being good for you. The version that believed the worst things people said about you. Letting go of those versions wasn't loss. It was you slowly stepping into who you actually were always meant to become, layer by layer, one release at a time. There's something sacred about the quiet moments where you finally stop performing for an audience that was never really watching that closely anyway. Most people are too consumed with their own lives to scrutinize yours the way you've imagined they have. That realization, once it finally settles in, is freeing in a way that's hard to describe until you've actually felt it. You were never under as much observation as your anxiety convinced you that you were. Think about how far you've actually come, not measured against anyone else's timeline, but measured against your own beginning. The person you were 5 years ago wouldn't recognize how much you've grown, how much you've survived, how much steadier you've become underneath all the noise. That growth is real. Even on the days it's hard to see. Even on the days you feel like you're standing still. Comment Amen if you can finally see how far you've come. Even if the road ahead still feels uncertain. You were not given this much depth, this much sensitivity, this much capacity to feel things deeply, just to spend your life shrinking yourself down to fit into spaces that were always too small for you. Whatever comes next in your story, it's allowed to be bigger than the version of life you've been settling for. Not because you're owed anything, but because you've quietly prepared for more than you've been given the chance to live out yet. Wherever you are right now, whatever this season looks like from the inside, I want you to know that none of it has been wasted. Every hard night, every quiet struggle, every season of feeling unseen has been building something in you that softness alone never could have built. You are allowed to feel exhausted and still believe that something good is still ahead of you. Those two things are not in conflict. They've actually been true at the same time for a very long time. If you've made it this far, something in you wanted to hear this today, and that matters more than you probably realize. You don't need a dramatic sign to know your life still has direction. Sometimes the sign is simply this: a quiet moment where the right words found you at the right time, and something inside you exhaled for the first time in a while. Comment "Amen" one more time if you're walking away from this feeling a little lighter than when you started. And let this be the moment you stop carrying everything alone, even if it's just one small step at a time.